Hello, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about Gordon Brown as Prime Minister. I think that he was better than Blair in terms of his he felt more of a Labour Party Prime Minister than Tony Blair did. But there were obviously a lot of problems with him. I think one was that he was, in the same way Tony Blair was, very inexperienced. These two men, they came out of university, they had an idea, they put it into practice and it worked for them. Right, they became leaders of the Labour Party and they got Labour into power, and then they, of course, with that, went into power themselves. But because they went into power so, inexperienced, it was very difficult, I think, for them to actually kind of be able to not, or kind of resist, towing the lines of lobby groups, for example, of interests of kind of American corporations, interests of essentially neoliberalism, which is, I don't think, the platform that they intentionally stood on when they first became elected leaders. I think if they would have stood on a platform of neoliberalism, then they would have never been elected leaders of the Labour Party. They stood on a platform of progression. They said that they wanted to introduce these reforms, and some of these reforms they did introduce. They did introduce some reforms on the House of Lords, and they introduced the 2010 Equality Act. But in reality, most of the things that they tried to push through, they couldn't, because they didn't even believe in it themselves. They said a lot about things they wanted to do. They said they wanted to improve public transport, improve the infrastructure, when actually, when it came to, push versus shove, they sold off all our industry. They continued the policies of Margaret Thatcher. They sold off our industry. They crippled our infrastructure. And it wasn't as bad as David Cameron government. It wasn't as bad as the coalition government, but it was not a Labour government. And of course that culminated in the invasion of Iraq, where we essentially followed America, in lockstep into Iraq without knowing the full picture, without knowing the actual intelligence. We went in there, and that ended in a lot of our brave young men dying as a result of that. Brave young men and women in the armed forces dying, and it also ended in the deaths of countless civilians in Iraq as well. And that was all at kind of the behest of the Americans. And I think this goes back to what I was saying in the previous video. Britain can actually be a very powerful country, and it can be a powerful Labour-led country. That's what I believe. And I think we can have independent foreign policy. Look at Turkey. Look at these countries. They don't have to play ball to anyone. We can trade with as many. We should be open for business. We should be trading. We should also have our infrastructure in place where we actually can reindustrialise. We have to have security. And the problem is, the current leadership and the leadership then, they were very much pro EU line and pro-American line. And I think that is actually a problem we've had. And that is why, well, again, this is very foreign policy, but this is why we're having a lot of difficulties on the international stage persuading, countries we've had such long and close relationships with to be on our side in this discussion. And the thing is with Gordon Brown is, he had a lot of problems to deal with when he was Prime Minister. He dealt with them in a better way Tony Blair did. But again, because of his inexperience, when the financial crash happened, for example, he wanted to help us. I don't think he was in the job completely for the money or the power, but he was definitely a schemer, that's for sure. He was a schemer, and he pushed Blair out. And then when the financial crash happened, he asked his assistants for tons of books to read. And he did read all these books, right? He went through these books, reading them, because he wanted to help the country. But at the same time, again, he was very inexperienced. And this is the problem. It shows a wider problem with the Labour Party, that we've actually become, the Labour Party has become very much a careerist politician party. It has become a neoliberal machine. And neoliberalism is the biggest thing we need to be fighting against in the Labour Party, because the Labour Party should be putting forward a policy which says we want to reindustrialise, we need nuclear energy, We also need green energy, but that comes afterwards. We need security, and we need an independent foreign policy. And a lot of people, they don't see that in the Keir Starmer leadership. You know, he isn't someone who's united the party because he's purged all the left-wing he's purged countless people in the left-wing faction, and he's suppressed all the other voices. And this is a big problem. We need an alternative movement. We need an alternative set of ideas that go back to the core basis of the Labour Party, and again, who it was made to represent. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown took traditional working class voters who voted Labour all their lives for granted that election, and they won because they went to a new voter base. I'm not saying we should just turn our backs now on the white collar voter and focus all our attention back onto the working class voters in traditional Labour heartlands. I'm not saying that at all. I think we should be focusing on both blue collar and white collar workers, but at the same time, you have to understand the roots of the Labour Party, and if we forget that, then what is the Labour Party? Why should there, what is the Labour Party if it doesn't represent Labour, essentially? And we're going to have to keep coming back to this theme because it's so critical to our analysis of the Labour Party, but also international affairs too, and what's going on in our communities as well. Not just our cities and our towns and our villages, but right across the country. And, how we can actually become a very much an independent and I think powerful nation. I think we have the potential to do that. We need a Labour Party who's going to stand up, though, for its core values. I don't think we have much of one at the moment, and we need to change that.